Hello, everybody. So, tonight for homework, what we're going to do is we're going to have a little conversation. We're trying to advance things and move them a little more quickly because I want to make sure we have a certain amount of information and background covered before we head to Gettysburg. So, I want to start tonight by talking about the Civil War, but Union strategy. So, this is the strategy that's going to be adopted by Lincoln and his government. And basically, most of their early strategy sort of focuses around one very important principle to keep in mind, and that is a recognition that the South is not self-sufficient. One of the advantages that we're going to have in the Union is that in the Confederacy, they don't really have the ability to sustain themselves long term. They Most of their soil is made for growing cotton. They have the population. They grow enough to eat on their plantations, but they're not going to be long term in terms of fighting a war. They're going to have to get support from elsewhere. So you can boil the Union strategy down into a plan that's called the Anaconda Plan. And the Anaconda Plan here is, I don't know if you can see it on your screen here. I'll try to pull it to the front. This is the idea of what was called General Scott, who's the original general, is the idea of a snake, an anaconda snake. And if you think about what an anaconda snake is, it's a constrictor. So the idea is they're going to cut, basically going to strangle and squeeze the Confederacy. So the idea of the big snake is that they're going to use that in a way that is going to cut the Confederacy off from the things it needs. Now, to make this be successful, you're going to have a very successful boycott, or excuse me, a what's called a blockade along the coast. Now, blockade along the coast, if you see here this dotted line, that dotted line is the idea that we're going to have a Union blockade in and around this area. Okay, so I'm going to just ungroup this for a second so I can move these guys around here. So we've got the Confederacy here, and you've got the Union up here. And what we're going to do is basically, because we have a Navy and the Confederacy does not, we're going to use that to cut off all of their support coming in from outside. They only have 6 naval ships. Okay, so we're going to block key waterways and ports and try to stop them from, being able to import and export things. Richmond. Obviously, you always want to take the capital of the country you're fighting against. It's a political victory. It becomes sort of this moral victory for them. So Richmond is going to become one of the critical elements. And the third part goes with what we talked about today, which is why Kentucky is so important, is if we can control the Mississippi River, and the Mississippi runs right down here. If you go right down Kentucky, the Mississippi runs into the Ohio River. They connect here, and the Mississippi flows right down here into New Orleans. If they can do that, they'll cut the Confederacy into 2 pieces and basically make it so that we can have some chance of success. So the war is going to be one of what we call attrition. When you have a war of attrition means that we're basically going to wear you down. We're going to try to wear down our opponent. So through a series of incidents, we're going to try to, as best we can, see that you can't get supplies and you're just going to eventually give up. The one big thing that we underestimate is that General Lee, who is going to become their primary commander, is a very offense-minded general. So he's not going to be concerned about sort of the general approach that many of the Union generals will have, which is let the war come to us. Lee is going to basically become very offense-minded. And that's really essential for understanding what's happening here. The Confederate States of America is going to have a couple of very important leaders. Jeff Davis, former Mississippi senator, Alexander Stephens from South Carolina. They will choose this as their motto, with God as our vindicator, kind of a reference to when the history is written, we're going to be proven correct. And notice who they have here in the center of their motto. The guy look familiar? That's George Washington. They set up a Confederate White House. Now, eventually, this is after the second half of obviously the second wave of secession has begun, and Jeff Davis will be elected president. Now, like I told you today in class, remember, one of the key things that is going to run and make it very difficult for the Confederacy is, as a Confederacy, they believe the power rests in the states. So one of the things that you're going to see throughout this is that there's going to be a tremendous amount of sort of power resting in the states, with them having autonomous ability to make decisions, which is going to make it really hard for Jeff Davis, who's going to try to coordinate this whole thing. Wait a second, I just seem to have lost where you went. Where'd you go? Wow, where'd you go? I usually have a clock here. I hope it's working. Anyway, so I've got that. I'm going to try to pause it here momentarily and check to see if I'm doing this correctly. Hold on a second, if this is right. Oops, where'd you go? Whoops. Hold on. I don't know if that worked or not. Let's see what happened here. I seem to have lost you. I'm not sure if you're there or not. Let's see what I can do. No, it says I'm working. Yeah. Okay, sorry. Got a little bit, there you are. I didn't have the one with the clock up here, and I wasn't sure it was working. Okay, so we got the clock, the webcam, everything's perfect. All right, sorry about that. Little digression there. All right, now the Confederates, very different strategy. They will adopt what's called a defensive war. And try to put this in your head. They don't have to win anything, okay? They just can't lose. It's very similar to the situation that we were in during the American Revolution, when the colonies didn't have to win, they couldn't lose. In this case, the Confederacy wants nothing but independence. So they don't have to win anything. They're not going in to take more territory, to acquire more territory. They're going to fight what's called a defensive war. They're going to wait for the Union to come to them. They're going to choose the time, the place for an attack, okay? Because they don't have to win. So if you want to suggest you're winning and you want to do this thing, you've got to come to us. They truly, truly believe that given enough time, the North is going to get tired, they're going to give up, and it's going to all be over. They also, I think, really overplay what they expect is the importance and the significance of King Cotton. They really believe that France and England are going to be very, very willing and interested in supporting the Confederacy, because and recognizing them as a sovereign state, because they want their cotton. Now, obviously, they're going to have to break the Union blockade. That is going to be really hard if they don't have international support. And the other thing that's important to understand has to do with their strategy, has to do with rivers. Now, if you recall, one of the goals was taking Richmond. Going here from the Red Star in DC down to the Blue Star here, that's about 90 miles. Well, that does not seem like a big threat. Somebody today in one of the classes says, why didn't they pick a capital that was further south? Like somehow that would make it safer. Well, actually, this is a pretty darn safe location, because if you look here and you're traveling down at this time in this period, before bridges and ways of crossing rivers, there are 6 different rivers that separate Richmond, that are east-west rivers that separate Richmond from DC. So in fact, the way to protect Richmond is actually going to be quite simple. They just got to blow up the bridges and hopefully wait. Now we're going to try to figure out a way around this. And their goal was then to create this as what they believed to be the new Confederacy. And this is what they ultimately thought they would have, was this area right through here. And that's what they expected, okay? Now on this side, I want to keep this for tomorrow, the north-south. So I'm going to ask you to jump ahead a few pages. We'll do that tomorrow in class, because I want to talk a little bit more about the early stages of the war. There's a couple of pieces of the war that don't really fit with other pieces, because it's not that they're insignificant, but they're smaller elements, like the war, the blockade, the Union blockade, and the war at sea. So we'll talk about those today. So in the early stages of the Union blockade, we are going to have the Union a lot of success at stopping Confederate trade. The blockade of the Confederate coast is decisive. Its goal is to starve them into submission. We want to stop them from basically getting their supplies. And if we can cut them off, they're not going to survive on what they own. I would argue that of everything we do in this war that is successful, that this element here is the most successful. If you look here at these facts and figures, 1860, the South exported about $202 million worth of exports. By 1862, after we begin with the blockade, that drops from 202 million to 4 million. That's a 98% decrease in the amount of money that they're making from trade. So I don't know how you want to spin it or how you want to, talk about it, but man, that does not get better than that in terms of success. Again, one of the concerns we had was about this idea of this Confederacy developing some kind of relationship with England. Well, the Trent Affair is going to be one of those events that's really going to make us very nervous, us in the Union. That we will stop, and as part of our blockade, we stop ships, right? We stop ships going in and out of Britain, in and out of the South, and we stop a British ship. And as we stop a British ship, lo and behold, if we don't discover there are 2 Confederate officials on this British ship, we're going to detain these men and we are going to question them, arrest and question them. One of them is John Slidell. I don't know if you recall back to the Mexican War, the U.S.-Mexico War. John Slidell was the guy who went down and tried to negotiate peace. Anyway, now he's a diplomat for the Confederacy. James Mason is the other guy. And basically, this is going to set up an international incident. Britain was furious that we had stopped one of their ships, that we had taken and detained passengers on their vessel. They demanded an apology. They demand a release of the men. I mean, it is really, really intense. And part of it is there was a fear that Britain does not want to really antagonize the United States. They don't want a war with the United States. And they think there's a little bit of a fear, that there's going to be an invasion of Canada. So you're going to see them shoring up their border with the United States and sending about 8,000 men down to the border. Lincoln will calm the situation down. A nation which endures fractious domestic division is exposed to a disrespect abroad. And one party, if not both, is sure sooner or later to invoke foreign intervention. To him, this was a no-brainer, and he just wanted it to be very clear from our perspective, and the British, as the British were thinking about this, that we were aware of what they were trying to do, and that we were not really happy about it. The U.S. will release the 2 men; things get calmed down, but I think it's the beginning of this real dalliance that the Confederacy will have with Britain, and the possibilities of there becoming a closer relationship. The one big sea battle that we will talk about, or I want to talk about right now, happens in early part of the war. This is March of 62. Again, so the war is going for about a year at this point, but it basically happens at sea. If you look here, this is Hampton Roads, and this is where the USS Virginia is coming from the south. We've got the this is the CSS Virginia and the USS Monitor, and they are 2 ships that are known as Ironsides. And what that means is, if you take a look here, this is sort of what the ships look like. I'm going to try to blow it up here and bring it to the front so you can see it. The ships are the first tankers that or ships that have metal sides, so cannonballs are not supposed to be able to go through them. Now they're heavy vessels, so they're weighed down, and they're not very particularly fast moving. The Merrimack, which is CSS Virginia, and the Monitor are basically going to go to the battle out here in the water around Hampton Bay. Some people call it an epic battle of combat for several hours against the ironclads. They're steam propelled. There's action. Here's a couple of action shots where you've got people kind of watching from the sidelines here. You can always tell the difference between the Monitor and the Merrimack, because the Monitor has like an O-like turret sticker. It almost looks like a surface submarine a little bit. And this is people on top of the Monitor. You can see them sort of working the top of the Monitor. The 2 are ultimately going to go to battle. Both ships are going to be damaged. The Merrimack or the Virginia is going to kind of skulk off here, and they're going to put her down right about here. I mean, part of it is the ship was just not prepared for what was coming, and I think that they just will never have the ability to replace any of their ships and the ability to make a good conflict out of this, or make a good use of their military. This is just a little FYI, which is sort of interesting. One of the things I've always found fascinating is when I come from out west, we just learned all the battle names, but we learned all the Union names. And those are every battle, not every battle, but most of the battles in the Civil War go by 2 names. If you are in the Union, you typically call the battle by the geographic location. It is the Battle of I'm trying to think. Bull Run. That's because of the Bull Run Creek. It's the Battle of Sharpsburg or the Battle of, Antietam. We call it Antietam because the Battle of Antietam Creek. They call it Sharpsburg because Sharpsburg is a city right near there. So basically, you've got sort of this interesting things where the Confederates call it by the city, nearest city. We refer to it as the geographic landmark. We in the Union. Okay. Excuse me. Sorry about this. Got the yawns here all of a sudden. Last thing I want to do is introduce one of the first battles. And it really is the only battle that we fight in 1861. People had no idea what was about to happen. I think most people expected that, the war was not going to be a long one, that there would be a back and forth, and ultimately, one side would win and the other side would lose, and the whole thing would be over. This is really, I think, going to be indicative of what the war is going to be about. And many of the battles, what we're going to do is we're going to lay out strengths, weaknesses, and sort of the overall strategy that each side pursues. So if you look at the strategy map here, the Americans expect a quick victory. They're going to march on to Richmond is their plan, and the whole thing will be over in, as Lincoln thought, 3 months. From the Confederate standpoint, they're going to threaten D.C. They believe that if they can get near Maryland, they can encourage dissent, that they'll show they can win victories, that the British are going to join them, and they'll put the whole thing to rest. Strengths, the U.S. will have a true enthusiasm advantage. We have a lot of young men, a lot of people joining up. It's the first war in a long time, and we're really kind of jazzed to be part of it. The strength that the Confederacy is going to have, and this will be consistent the whole way through the war, is going to be military leadership. From Robert E. Lee down to his generals and colonels below him, he has really some of the better generals. And it's interesting when many of the men left West Point, because a lot of these boys had gotten to all serve together at West Point. And we'll talk more about that tomorrow. But when they get out in the battlefield, they'll distinguish themselves, right? But most of the leaders, the people who are good at commanding men at West Point, ended up coming from Southern states, and which will end up going back and siding with the Confederacy. So that's going to be a real problem for the Union long term. On the U.S. side, we were totally unprepared for this. And this is going to be one of the ongoing problems that the Confederacy is going to have all the way through this, is the size of their army and their inability to follow up, meaning they are able to strike a victory, but then they don't have the men that they can use to kind of finish it off. This particular battle happens about 35 miles due west of D.C. So there's D.C., there's Bull Run Creek, right outside of Manassas, and that is where the battle is going to take place. You've got the Confederates coming here. They're going to be in red. Blue, you've got the Union coming here. The Union's commanded by a guy named McDowell. Beauregard is going to be commanding the Confederates. It's going to be a battle that's notable for disorganization and actually chaos is a good way to put it. Stonewall Jackson will earn his moniker here. He will earn the name Stonewall. His name was, what was his first name? Thomas. His name was Thomas Jackson, and he will earn the moniker Stonewall because at one point, they're on this field of battle, and they're back and forth, and it looked like the Union was winning and kind of pushing them out. And Jackson rode out in front of his men, and he stood up on his horse. He's standing up in the stirrups, and he's like, "Come on, men, rally to the Virginians!" And all these people saw him, and they're like, "Look at Jackson. He's like a stone wall. Let's go support him." And so they all go kind of rushing in there. And what comes next is actually sort of a little moment of infamy. There really is a chaotic scene in battles at this time. But for Americans who were not fighting, this may be their only chance to actually see a war. Because in Europe, when there were battles, you used to be able to go out and watch them because they were nice and organized, and one side here and one side here, and they fought against each other. And then one side sort of came out on top, and the victor was declared, and everything was hunky-dory. Well, so many of these Americans, this might be their one epic battle they get to see. So people ride out. We're not talking military here, folks. Civilians ride out to the battlefield with their horses, with their carriages, picnic baskets, blankets, entertainment, their little spectacles to watch. The kids are playing, politicians, the Washington elite, and they're all out there because they don't want to miss the war. Well, the battle's raging down in this valley down below, right? And they're back and forth and back and forth. And finally, Stonewall Jackson, the Virginians, start pushing, and they push towards the Americans, the Union Army, and the Union Army turns around and runs back to Washington, right through the picnickers. So you can see in this picture here, you've got the picnickers running right beside people who are shooting at them. You've got people with baskets. You've got just absolute chaos in the retreat. The local newspapers refer to it as the Great Skedaddle, because everybody got sort of, kind of overwhelmed by the whole thing. Some people describe it was the first time they heard the rebel yell. And I can't do the rebel yell, but you can Google it and find out what it sounds like. It's actually pretty intense. One guy said there is nothing like it in referring to the rebel yell in this side of the infernal region. The peculiar sensation it sends down your backbone can never be told. But I think for both sides, there was a realization that this war was not going to be fast. This war was not going to be over quickly. Now, just one side note, this last story I'll tell you, because this is a good story. This is the home, a home of a guy named Wilmer McLean. Wilmer McLean lived out there near Manassas, right where the battlefield happened. These are basically some pictures that were taken of the same house after the war. So what's going to happen is this is a serious battle. And it was literally, the war started right out here in his front yard. And when he comes home, there were people everywhere, bodies laying everywhere. I mean, this takes months to get it all cleaned up, right? His home is gone, everything's there. So he said, that's it. I'm done with Northern Virginia. I want to get out of here. So he took his family and he settled in a nice, quiet little town in the deep South, or not deep Southern Virginia, a little town called Appomattox, Appomattox Courthouse. And that's where he will take his family. And I will finish the story at the end of this unit. But Wilmer McLean, the battle started in his front yard. He goes to Appomattox to sort of just get away from it all. But for many of the people that were here, they didn't know where to bury the soldiers. They didn't know what to do with them. So one of the people that they were really angry with is Robert E. Lee, because Robert E. Lee is really perceived by a lot of the men of the day to be a real traitor. So one of the things that the government tried to do to trick Lee into, or to use to capture him, is the government of the Union decided to issue a new tax to help pay for some of the war costs. And the tax was a tax that had to be paid in person by the head male of the household. Well, Robert E. Lee lived in this little home right here. This little home right here is right across the river from Washington, D.C. It actually looks down on Washington, D.C. Well, when Robert E. Lee doesn't pay his taxes, they reclaim his property and turn it into a military post. And they turn that into a military zone. Okay, well, that happens. The government comes in and confiscated things. But after Manassas, when they didn't have anywhere to bury their bodies, they thought the best thing to do to get Lee back and provide a place to put the soldiers is that in his rose garden, they started burying the people who had lived through. Oops, where'd it go? Got some pictures hidden here or there. Oops, why is it not working? There we go. That right there. This is the Lee Custis Mansion. If you've ever been down to DC and you've looked up the hill from the Lincoln Memorial, you will notice this hill directly across from the Lincoln Memorial. They started by burying soldiers from Manassas in his rose garden. And his rose garden was right outside his bedroom, with the idea that if Lee ever came back to his home, he would have to face the fact that these were men that died because of him and his treachery. Right outside here. And then as the war went on, they buried people all around his house. So by the time he got back at the end of the war, there were thousands and thousands of bodies buried right around his home. Lee was beside himself. He sued the federal government and said that tax you put on is illegal and you can't do that. And the government took a look at it and said, you're right, they shouldn't have done this. You can have your property back. But now he's got his property and thousands of people who are buried, right? So he will re-gift the land back to the government to become a final resting place for American soldiers. Today, it is Arlington Cemetery. And this is where, if you were ever in DC, and you can look right across the river here, that's where the Jefferson or Lincoln Memorial is right across the river here. That is the Lee Custis home. So, all right, we'll pick up here tomorrow. Bye.